So our message this morning will be brought to us by Dr. Trott. Compassion in care is something we all can learn more of. And as we look to Jesus, that certainly is the source of compassion the best compassion we can experience. Dr. Trott, will you come share with us?
It's a great honor for me to be here today. I found that when I have to teach, I learn 100 times more than when I listen. So this has been a wonderful experience for me to be here. Now, I want to start by reading from Isaiah 65, verse 24. And it says, well, actually, I want to back up a little bit. And in the beginning of that chapter, it says, I was sought for by those who did not ask for me. I was found by those who did not seek me. When I was younger, I was brought up as a Presbyterian. My parents would drop me off at church on Sunday morning. They wouldn't go themselves, and then they would pick us up later. I guess it was kind of a babysitting service, but we didn't take it very seriously because my parents didn't take it very seriously. And so I kind of drifted away from faith. So I wasn't really looking for God's guidance in my life. But as time went on, I noticed that a lot of things were happening that were scientifically unexplainable. I just couldn't understand why they happened. And it came to pass that I noticed that I wasn't praying, but you could say my prayers were being answered. It says in Isaiah 24, it shall come to pass that before they call, I will answer. And I had the feeling in my life that prayers were being answered that I wasn't asking for. And one of those was how I got into dental school. Now, this is going to be a very humbling experience for me to tell you this story, but when I went to college a few years before that, my parents had gotten divorced, so I had no financial support from them to go to college. So I got a job as a custodian at the National Bureau of Standards in Boulder, Colorado. And since I was the low man on the totem pole in the department, they assigned me to clean all the bathrooms in the building. There were, I don't know, about a dozen large bathrooms. It was a very big building, and I cleaned like 38 toilets every night. And I worked from like 4 o'clock till midnight, and then I'd study and go to school. I didn't do terribly well in school. And when I graduated, I was living in Riverside, California, and my brother arranged a blind date for me with a girl who was a Seventh-day Adventist. And a very nice girl. She, in fact, talking about Seventh-day Adventist girls, when we were working as missionaries in St. Vincent, there were a lot of Seventh-day Adventist churches there. 10% of the population on this little tiny island in the Caribbean were Seventh-day Adventists. And there were a lot of Rastafarians. This is a religion where they grow their hair long, and they smoke marijuana, and they say the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. In other words, everything belongs to the Lord. So if you steal, you're not stealing from anybody because it belongs to the Lord. So these men who are Rastafarians, who are stoned and are very generous with your property, I frequently heard them say that they wanted to marry a Seventh-day Adventist girl because these Seventh-day Adventist girls were so nice. And in fact, they told my dental assistant one day that they would like to marry her because she was a Seventh-day Adventist. And she said to them, don't you think we would like to marry a Seventh-day Adventist? But anyway, Anyway, I graduated from college, and I had not done terribly well in college. I was working nights, and I didn't study as much as I should have. And when I graduated, and I got this blind date with a girl who was a Seventh-day Adventist, and she gave me a Bible for Christmas. And I read it like you would read a novel. I just sat down and read the whole thing from beginning to end, because I used to love to read. I'd get like Gulag Archipelago, a Russian history of the prisons in Russia. There were a couple of volumes. It was probably close to 2,000 pages. I just would read through the whole thing. I love to read, and which I think really helped a lot. So I read the Bible, and when I got to the Sermon on the Mount, it says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek." It talks about those who are kind to others. Now, previously, a few months before, I was living in Colorado, and I had gotten very sick, and I had a next-door neighbor that was a Catholic. And he was about 78, and his wife was 75 or so. He was a retired state senator from New Hampshire. And when I got sick, he would come over and take care of me. They'd bring chicken soup, and they did their best to take care of me. They didn't have the Adventist Health Message, but they were very kind to me. A tree fell on my car, smashed the roof in, and they arranged for a body shop to take care of it. The body shop charged me maybe a fraction of what it actually cost to fix it. And when I went to a doctor in town, they said, "Well, you're a friend of Ted Ryan, the retired state senator, so this is on us. You don't have to pay." So everywhere I would go, when they found out I was a friend of my neighbor, they wouldn't charge me anything. And he took incredibly good care of me. And one day I went over to their house for lunch, and Mr. Ryan was gone. And his wife said to me, she said, "I cannot understand my husband." I said, "What do you mean? You've been married for 55 years and you don't understand your husband? How can you?" She goes, "His faith is so strong, it's a mystery to me." But he had really strong faith in God. Well, anyway, I left and went on, and was living in Loma Linda at that time. I'd gotten a job working for a neurosurgeon as an electronics technician for him at the hospital. And I just read the Bible, but I got to this passage where it talked about the Sermon on the Mount. And when I read it, it was a description of my next-door neighbor, of all the kindness he had done. And I thought, maybe this is not a fairy tale. Maybe this is not an old wives' tale. Maybe it's true. So I started thinking, maybe there's something to this. And I started going to Sabbath school there in Loma Linda. And one day, after I got baptized, and not long after I was baptized, my Sabbath school teachers came to me and said, "Jim, we think you need to go to dental school." And I said, "Oh, no, that's not possible. That would be ridiculous for me. I have 2200 vision. I am colorblind. I have very poor hand-eye coordination. My grades are abysmal from college. I don't have the money to go." I argued with my Sabbath school teachers for about 20 minutes, and I very patiently explained to them all the reasons I could never become a dentist. And after I was all done, they just smiled at me and they said, "Well, it wouldn't hurt if you would apply, would it? Wouldn't hurt." And I said, "No, I guess it wouldn't hurt." Now, in those days, it cost $15 to apply to dental school. And now, I don't know, it's about $800 or $1,000. You have to apply to different organizations, and it's a very laborious process. In fact, I went I was thinking about working on a master's degree in religion at Loma Linda because the school would pay for it for free. And they said, oh, it's easy to apply. Just follow these 24 steps to apply. And each one was, a long application, security and history and all sorts. And I just looked at it and said, no, I think I'll pass that up. But it was very easy when I was applying to dental school. So I applied in mid-October. About 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the school asking me to come in for an interview. And I had friends who were applying to dental school, and I told them, I said, I got a letter from the school. They want me to come in for an interview. And my friends looked at me and they go, oh, Trott, you are so hopeless. We all got a letter from the school. It's a form letter saying, we've received your application, and if we want you to come in for an interview, we'll call you. So go home and read your letter. Cool off, okay? So I went home and reread the letter, and it says, come in November the 7th at 9 in the morning, and we'll interview. So I went in for the interview, and I was interviewed by Bob Sutton, who was the assistant dean, and he greeted me, and he shook my hand, and he goes, Jim, it's good to meet you. So you want to be a dentist? And I didn't want to, and I went, and I didn't say anything, and I just kind of hung my head, and I didn't know what to say. And there was a clock on the wall behind Dr. Sutton, and I'm watching the second hands going tick, 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 tick. And for like about 40 seconds, I didn't say anything, and I had this blank stare. And I thought, he must think I'm really stupid. I can't answer a simple question. So I said, I think it would be a good opportunity. And I mumbled something. And we started talking. Now, I had done fairly well on the DAT, which is the entrance exam. And he said, how did you prepare for this exam? Because you did fairly well on it. And I said, how did I prepare? Let's see. Well, the night before the exam, I had a fever of 101, so I went to bed at 8 o'clock and I got a lot of sleep. And he kind of looked at me like, oh, really? Then he asked me, now this is where it gets really difficult. He said to me, do you know how many people applied to dental school this year? And I said, I really don't know. Now, it's not a good idea to go for an interview and not know anything about the company or the business or what they're doing, because they're going to think you're an idiot, I imagine when Hannah applied for this prestigious job she has, she knew the director, what his research was, and they were probably have a conversation about some of his research papers. So she, this was an intelligent conversation she was having when she interviewed. Well, that didn't happen to me. And he said, there are 1,700 people applying for 94 positions. It's very competitive. And he goes, do you know where you stand academically in these 1,700 people? And I kind of cringed, and I said, well, I have no idea. And I kind of knew, but he said, you are number 1,700 out of 1,700. And I started laughing because I thought, well, there's no way I'm going to get in, and I didn't really want to get in, and I felt this wave of relief wash over me. Like, oh, phew. I was so relieved, and I smiled, and I suddenly looked very happy, and we talked for a while, and I said, well, there's only one way to go from here, and that's up, right? So anyway, he goes, but you had some very good recommendations. And I said, I did? He goes, yes. You had letters of recommendation from Dr. Booker and Dr. McDonald. Now, they were my Sabbath school teachers. And Dr. McDonald was the father of this girl that I had dated who gave me a Bible. But after I had dated her for about a month or so, she gave up on me. That she thought I was a hopeless heathen and that there was no redemption for someone like me, and so she dumped me. But her father still liked me, and he used to invite me over and talk to me and things. But so they had written me letters of recommendation. And Dr. Sutton asked me, do you know who they are? And I said, yes, they're my Sabbath school teachers. And then he goes, do you know anything else about them? Now, I didn't want to mention the girlfriend or anything like that, so I said, well, not really, not a lot. And he goes, they're both on the board of directors of Loma Linda University. In the 100-year history of the university, no school here, not the medical school, the nursing, dentistry, allied health, no one has ever gotten 2 letters of recommendation from board members. This is unprecedented. And I kind of went, oh, really? And then he goes, welcome to Loma Linda. So I got accepted when I should not have been accepted. I got accepted because someone helped me and opened the doors for me and believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I was convinced I couldn't do this. And when I got accepted and I met the other students in dental school, I was like awed and impressed because the other students were in the top 2% of young people in the United States as far as their intelligence and their accomplishments, and these were really bright, energetic. They played piano and violin, So I would ask someone just as a joke, so do you play piano or violin? And they would go, both. And I was kind of like, whoa, these people are like way, way over my head. And I kept thinking, what am I doing here? Why am I here? Why am I here? What am I doing here? And it was a really astonishing experience. Now, that's not the only time in my life. There's been lots of times where I felt wonderful things happen to me that should not have happened. And one of them was meeting my wife. I graduated from dental school and I practiced for a while and I was not married, and I was about 42 years old and I was still not married. And my mother came to me one day and said, Jim, you need to get married. It's time for you to get married. You need someone to take care of you because you cannot take care of yourself. I thought, oh, really? It's that obvious, So, and it was true. I really couldn't take care of myself. I was very absent-minded, and I was always thinking about something else other than where I'd get in my car and I'd drive for 40 miles, and I'm thinking about something, and I'd realize that I was 40 miles going the wrong way, So she said, you need to get married. And I was working at that time in a clinic in Fresno, California, where this clinic was owned by a Dr. Warner. He owned 3 offices, and he had about 15 dentists working for him. I had just started working there, and after I was there for 3 months, he asked me to become the general manager of all the offices. And just because he liked the way that I talked to people and took care of the patients. We had a patient once who came in, and he was mentally retarded a little bit, and he couldn't talk well. So when he wanted to express himself that he was very enthusiastic about something, he'd pull a knife out. And one day he pulled a knife on one of the doctors and the dental assistant in the operatory to make a point. And they slid out of the room, and they were very upset, and they came running down the hall and said, Dr. Trott, somebody pulled a knife on us. And so I'd kind of seen this guy before and realized he was a little retarded. So I walked in the room and sat down, and I said, you don't seem very happy. Is something bothering you? And I talked to him for a while. I got him to put his knife away. And I said, some of the doctors here, they're not listening very well. And, maybe they're not listening to you. And you might find that if you went to another clinic, you'd find better doctors. And he goes, I think so. And so he left, and he never came back. But I felt like, even in dangerous situations, God can guide us and lead us. Now, most people think I'm crazy when I tell them I walked into a room and sat down where someone was holding a knife, but I think this guy wasn't really that dangerous. But anyway, I was working in this clinic, and there was another Seventh-day Adventist there named Dr. Stanek, who had graduated from Loma Linda. He'd been a missionary in Trinidad and Tobago Islands in the Caribbean, beautiful tropical islands. And they used to come over to my house on Friday evening, and we'd have a Vespers. And I told them a story. My mother said I need to get married, so they were thinking about this. And while they were missionaries in Trinidad, one day they decided to go butterfly hunting. So they drove down to the southern end of the island where it was very remote. There were not a lot of traffic. On the main road that they were on, there were like 2 or 3 cars a day driving down this main road. Very remote. And they found a remote area. They get out and they start looking for butterflies. And they're walking through the forest, and they came upon a little house in the jungle with a dirt floor and a tin roof with 10 children. It had a dirt floor and no electricity, and it's very, very poor, extremely dirt poor. And when they found this little home, they stumbled across it. The mother, who was a Hindu, she had gone to an Adventist school for 2 years when she was younger. So she still sang the Adventist hymns, and when she found these people were Adventists, she said she welcomed them into her home and said, look for butterflies in our flower garden. There's lots of butterflies in the flower garden. So they stayed and they collected butterflies. And 2 weeks previous to this, my Mala, who eventually became my wife, this young girl who became my wife, she had gone to the family altar to pray. Now, the family altar was a little like podium, and it had a giant ostrich. It looked like an ostrich egg. It was like black stone that the father, who was a Hindu priest, had found in a local stream, and it was this perfectly egg-shaped rock. It was polished, and it looked really beautiful. And so he said, this is a gift from heaven, and he brought it home and set it up in their family altar, and that was their household god. There are as many gods in Hinduism as there are Hindus. Elvis Presley and Winston Churchill are Hindu gods. And so everything and everybody is capable of being a god. So she had been praying to this for about 20 years, praying every day. She wanted to have friends, and she wanted to do well in school, and she wanted some new clothes and shoes without holes in them, and she'd been praying, and none of her prayers had ever been answered. Never. Not one. And she was kind of disgusted with this process of praying to a meaningless God. And so one day she turned away from the altar and she looked the other way. She looked up into the heavens and said, if there is a real God, show me. So, shortly thereafter that, she had a dream. Now, it's hard for me to believe these things really happen, because I have had a few dreams that I think were very important, but up to that time I had not. But she had this dream that a little white woman a Caucasian woman dressed in a white dress, very short, came to her and was talking to her and said, let's be friends. Can I get your address so that we could write to each other? So she had this dream, and she didn't pay any attention to it. A couple weeks later, these 2 missionaries show up, and Dr. Stanek's wife, whose name is Katrina, was a little Caucasian woman and wearing a white dress. But Mala did not remember the dream. So they're talking, and Dr. Stanek and he had some friends, and they were playing a ukulele and singing songs to the kids and entertaining them. Now, in the Caribbean, in the southern part, there's no television, and there was very, very few people even driving on the main road. So when a guest comes, that's the entertainment. So all the kids came out, and they want to see what's going on, and talking to they're all gathered around, and they're making friends with them. And as the Staniks were getting ready, they caught some butterflies, they're getting ready to leave. The family loaded them down with oranges and lemons and all the fruit that was growing, and coconuts and pineapple. My brother-in-law, his name is VJ, they had coconut trees growing in their yard, and the trees kind of slant upward. And he would climb these trees by putting his foot on the tree and holding, and he would literally walk up the tree. It was just astonishing. So anyway, they loaded them down with fruit, and just before they left, Katrina went to Mala, who was the oldest child, and said, "Would you give me your address? Let's write to each other. Let's become friends." And now, suddenly, she remembers the dream, and she recognizes that this woman is the woman that was in her dreams. And she's like stunned by this and shocked. So she takes the address, they write to each other, and they invite her to visit them in the capital city of Port of Spain. She goes there, and she's astonished by their behavior, how they treat each other. Because when it's time to eat, when it's time to eat in her home, the father, Mala's father, would eat first. And only after he had eaten everything he'd wanted, then the wife and the children could eat. And there was frequently not enough food for all of them. But the father would always get his fill, and then everybody else could eat. It was a very patriarchal, very selfish kind of arrangement. But when Dr. Stanek and his wife eat, Dr. Stanek would sit down at the table, and he wouldn't begin eating until his wife came and sat down. And Mala was astonished by this. And they were kind to each other. They were polite. They said please and thank you. And Dr. Stanek thanked his wife for everything that she did. And so she was kind of amazed by this. And later, the Staneks asked her if she would like to go to an Adventist college. There's an Adventist college in Trinidad, and they sent her there. And they had a week of prayer. Well, actually, before she left, she went to her mother and said, I've been invited to go to this Adventist college, but I don't think I want to go, because if I go, I might become a Christian, and that would be horrible. I don't want to become a Christian. And the mother said to her, "Girl, you go, because it would be better for you to become a Christian than for you to stay in this village and end up an alcoholic and pregnant like all the other girls in the village." Because there was no hope for them. No one in that village had ever gone to college. And I remember when I first went to Trinidad, and we were driving through the village, and we were driving past some of the homes, and they're in the jungle, and they're quite far apart, like an eighth of a mile or quarter of a mile apart. Not a lot of people. But the kids, they're teenagers, up to 18, like 16 years old, they're running around the yard stark naked. I mean, they're very poor. They don't even have any clothes. But there's just no future for these young people. So the mother said, "You go." So she went. They had a week of prayer. And Mala was very impressed by what she heard. And she went forward and got baptized. And then her life fell apart after she got baptized. Because her father, who was a Hindu pundit or a Hindu priest, within 2 hours he heard that she had been baptized. And there are no telephones in this village. So how did he hear that she had been baptized? Well, he claimed, and Mala verified, that he communicated with spirits. And these were not divine angels that he was communicating with. She said that sometimes he would become what she called demon-possessed, and he would speak in different voices and become very angry and very violent. It's said that the fallen angels, some of them, if you read Roger Murnau's book, they lost their sanity when they were cast out of heaven, and they're very angry and impatient and vicious almost. And she said her father would assume these really vicious characteristics and speak in different voices. So the father found out, and a few weeks later, Mala went back home. Her father was not there at the time. He was out working somewhere. And the mother said to her, "It would be better if you left home and never came back for your own safety. Don't come back." Now, I read an article in National Geographic about Trinidad, and it said that the police in Trinidad were kept busy looking for wives and children who disappeared when they disobeyed their father. So apparently, if you disobey your husband or father there, that you would disappear in the jungle. Now, I've been in the jungle, and there are alligators and crocodiles back there, and it wouldn't be hard to disappear there. I've actually seen some of the crocodiles there. So now the Staniks, Dr. Stanik and his wife, they get a letter from Mala saying that my mother says don't come home, and they're thinking, what are we going to do to this girl? They felt responsible that she had been kicked out of her own home. And Katrina started praying. Every night she would pray for an hour and a half for this girl. What should we do? Now, after we got married, Katrina came to us and confessed that she had been praying every night for an hour and a half for Mala, this young girl, what to do. And one day when she was praying, Katrina says, the Lord told her to fly this girl to the United States and introduce her to me. Okay? That's what Katrina said. And so she heard this, and she goes, but we don't have any money to buy an airplane ticket. They had come back from missionaries. They had huge school loans to pay off, and all their money went for rent and school loans, and there was like nothing left over. They were driving a car that was 20 years old. Dr. Stanek, even though he worked full-time, he would go help his father laying linoleum and carpets. His father had a business where he laid carpets, and Dr. Stanek would do this to make a little extra money. Money was very tight. So Katrina's going, how can we need $700 to buy a ticket. So she had previously written a $700 check to the auto insurance company. So she wrote a letter to them and asked them to cancel the insurance, and so they sent her check back. So she took the $700 and bought an airline ticket and flew this girl to the United States. So once she arrived, now she lived in a very primitive state. She told me in her home they had one spoon, and there were 10 kids, and so they all ate with their fingers, and the mother would use the spoon to stir the food. And once in a great while, one of the kids could use the spoon, but they had one spoon. And she had not used knife and fork before. So the Staniks had to teach her how to use a knife and a fork, and a lot of other things to teach her. But they called me and said, we have a house guest, could we bring her over for Vespers on Friday nights? And I said, sure, bring her over. So they brought over this young girl, and she was very young and very pretty and very quiet. I mean, she had not been out. She'd never been to a restaurant, anything like that, living in the forest. So when they brought her over, they would always have her sit next to me. And if I went into the kitchen to prepare food or get something, they would send her along to get the food. And they made sure that she was always there, and they brought her over every time. It was my birthday in August, and Katrina had her make a cake, and so she brought a little birthday cake for me. And I used to go into the Sequoia National Parks. I'd rent a cabin there on the weekends and go up into this cabin on the weekends, and they would always find out where I was going, and they would show up there with this girl, and sometimes they'd stay with me in the cabin, and they'd bring other friends along to kind of cover their tracks. And but one day we had a little potluck lunch on Sabbath up in the mountains in this cabin. And afterwards, I ask everybody, I always eat too much at potlucks because Adventist food is really pretty good. And so I wanted to go for a walk so I wouldn't get really sleepy. And I asked the Staniks, and they didn't want to go. There was another couple with us, and they didn't want to go. And Katrina goes, why don't you ask Mala? Maybe she wants to go. So I asked Mala, and she wanted to go. And we started walking through the forest, and she goes, are there bears in the forest here? I've heard there's bears here. And I said, oh, yeah, there's a few bears here, but you hardly ever see them, and you never, ever hear any reports about someone being eaten by a bear because, well, if they're eaten, they don't file a report, so you never hardly ever hear about this. And now she's getting really scared, and she goes, well, how do you know where the bears are? Now they have in the sequoias, they have these giant redwood trees that are like 10 feet across or more. And so we're walking through all these giant redwood trees. And I said, well, the bears usually hide behind the trees, and when you walk by, they'll grab you. And so we were just about to walk by one of these giant trees, and I go, you go first. And she screams, and she realizes that I'm teasing her, and she's very upset with me. But anyway, we climbed to the top of the lookout point where you can watch the sunset, and we're sitting there waiting for the sun to go down, and another couple ambles up, and it turned out the man's wife was a dental hygienist, so we're talking a little bit. And then they wander off, and they come back about half an hour later and sit down. And the husband's sitting next to me, and he leans over and goes, so, did you fall in love yet? And I said, I think so. And so we went down and went back to work that week, and I finally got the nerve up to ask her out on a date. I invited her to go to Morro Bay, which is a state park right on the ocean south of Carmel by the sea. It's a beautiful place. And there are like sea lions and otters, and you can sit on these little cliffs overlooking the water, and the otters will dive down and they'll get a clam, and then they'll come up to the surface and float on their back and put the clam here, and then they take a rock and they break open the clam. It's one of the few animals that uses a tool, and then they'll eat the oyster out. So we're sitting there watching all the wildlife and everything, and we're having a picnic there, enjoying it. And I asked my wife, Mala, she wasn't my wife yet, I said, what are your goals? What are you hoping to do? She said, well, I would like to go to college and become a nurse and get a house, a nice house and a car. And she's talking like this. But she never mentioned anything about getting married or having a family. And I said to her, I said, well, you're talking about all these accomplishments, but you never said anything about getting married. Usually women talk about getting married. So, do you think you'll ever get married? She goes, oh, no, I'll never get married. And I said, really, why not? She said, no one would want to marry me. And I was kind of surprised, and I said, well, I'm sure that's not true. I'm sure a lot of people would want to marry you. And she said, who would want to marry me? And just to be polite, I felt kind of sorry for her. I really walked into this one, okay? Just to be polite and encourage her, I said, well, I would like to marry you. And as soon as I said that, I thought, what did I just say? I was like, and so I just shut up after that. I didn't say a word for the next 2 hours. I was afraid to say anything. But I started thinking about what I had said, just to be polite to her, to try to encourage her. And I thought, well, maybe this wouldn't be such a bad idea. She's a very nice girl, very kind and polite, and the thing that kind of cemented the deal was that she was under the guidance of the Staniks, who were missionaries. And Katrina Stanek, maybe someday I'll tell you stories about Katrina. She is a prayer warrior, and when she prays, mountains move. I mean, I could tell you stories about her that are just they're unbelievable about how prayers have been answered. So I knew Katrina was a prayer warrior and that her prayers, Katrina grew up in communist Yugoslavia, and her father was a pig farmer. And she met an evangelist, a street evangelist, who was just going around kind of talking to people on the subways or the buses, and she met this woman who started talking to her and influenced her to become an Adventist. And when she became an Adventist, she heard the health message. She went home and she told her father, said, "Father, you should not be raising pigs. They're an unclean animal." And she was 17 years old at the time. And her father goes, "Little girl, let me run the farm. You go to college. Just stay out of my business." So she's praying for her father and the pigs, and she goes to bed that night. She wakes up in the morning, and her mother is sitting on the end of the bed, which her mother had never done before. And so Katrina's kind of surprised. The mother was waiting for her to wake up. And when she woke up and said, "Hello, Mother, why are you here?" And the mother said, "Have you been praying for the pigs?" And Katrina said, "Yes, in fact, I was." And the mother gets very angry and gets up and walks out of the room and says, "Don't ever pray for us again." So Katrina now is, what happened? She gets up, gets dressed, goes outside, and there's 50 dead pigs outside. They all died. So anyway, when Katrina prays, miracles happen. So a few days later, after I unwittingly proposed to my wife, the Staniks invited me over. And Dr. Stanek is a real comedian. He's always telling jokes. He's always teasing people. And his wife said, "Don't tease Dr. Trott when he comes over here. Don't make fun of him. And don't start singing or hymning the wedding march or anything like that. Just try to be really polite." So I went over there, and they invited me for dinner, and Mala was there, and the Staniks, and they made a nice dinner, and nobody said a word during the dinner. It was really creepy, and so I ate and I excused myself and I left. But they called me over a few days later, and Katrina said to me, "I understand that you've asked Mala to marry you." Now, when we went to Morro Bay, it was about a 2 or 3 hour drive from Fresno, and after we had this picnic, we walked around the park, and then we went out to dinner at a really nice restaurant in Carmel by the Sea. And we sat down for dinner. It was about 8:30 when we sat down after sundown, and we started eating, and we were talking, and time went by, and it was about 11 or 11:30, and the manager came up to us and said, "I don't want to interrupt your conversation because I can see you're having a wonderful conversation, but we normally close at 9 o'clock. It's now 11 o'clock, and I would like to be able to send my staff home. So would it be all right if maybe you could come back later?" Or so anyway, we got up and we left and we drove home, and we didn't get home till 2 in the morning or something like that. And Katrina was waiting for Mala. She was in the living room praying, and she said, well, what happened? Now, before Mala had gone on this picnic with me, Mala said, I don't want to go on a date with him. I wouldn't know what to do. I've never been on a date before. I don't know how. I mean, what if we go to a restaurant and they have 3 forks and 2 spoons, and I wouldn't know what to do. And Katrina goes, well, just do whatever he does. Whatever he does, whatever fork he picks up, you pick up that fork, and just whatever he drinks, you drink the same thing. Just order what he orders, and so you won't have to make any mistakes. And she goes, well, what if he holds my hand? What am I going to do? Or they went through all this what if, and I don't remember what they all were, but there were about 20 or 30 of these what ifs. And so Katrina would coach her on what to do. And the last one was, well, what if he kisses me? Which actually happened that night on the way home. So they get home, and Katrina says, what happened? Why are you so late? I've been waiting for you. And Mala says, everything that you said might happen did happen. So anyway, a few days later, they invited me over, and Katrina goes, I understand you asked her to marry you. Are you really serious? Because if you're not, you need to break this off, because you're going to break her heart. So I said, I am serious. Because she was a really nice girl, and she was being mentored by the Staniks, who I had great respect for. And there's an old proverb that says, the apple never falls far from the tree. And I thought, if this girl is being mentored by Katrina and Dr. Stanik, she's going to turn out really well. So I thought that she would make a good wife. So I said, I am serious. And then Katrina goes, why should we let you marry her? What are you going to do for her? And so I'd never been asked that question before. I didn't know how to respond to it. And I said a quick prayer for wisdom. And I knew that she was very poor and had no education. So I said, well, I'll see to it that she gets an education. I'll help support her family, which was very poor. I had no idea how expensive that promise was going to be. And I will always love her. So Katrina hears these 3 promises, and she goes, okay, on those conditions we'll let you marry her. Now go tell her just what you told me and see how she responds. So we went for a walk in the moonlight, and I told her the 3 promises, and she accepted. And Mala told me that while she was considering my proposal, she said that this voice told her, you better say yes, because you'll never get a chance like this again. So she said yes, and a couple months later we got married. Now when we got married, the Staniks didn't have any money, I didn't have a lot of money, and we were looking for a place to get married. And Mala had grown up in a forest, in a jungle actually, and Katrina had once visited a Dr. Schooley, James Schooley, who lived right outside Yosemite National Park. This beautiful park, and his property was right on the perimeter of the park, and there were deer grazing around his home, and it's beautiful there. And Katrina had once delivered, she worked for the hospital, and she had to deliver some packages to Dr. Schooley, and this was like 5 years previously, she had been to this home, and it was this perfect place for a wedding. And so Katrina, being a prayer warrior, she thought this would be a great place, and she prayed about it. So she took Mala, and they drove up to Dr. Schooley's house, and they knocked on the door. Now, she'd met this man once to deliver a package, right? They knock on the door, and Dr. Schooley opens the door, and his wife, Mimi, is standing next to him. And she says, Dr. Schooley, you probably don't remember me. I'm Katrina. I delivered a package to you a few years ago. But Mala here is going to get married in about a month, and we were looking for a place to have a wedding, and we were wondering if we could have a wedding at your house. Okay, she doesn't know this guy, okay? And so Dr. Schooley, he kind of thinks about this for a minute, and he looks over at his wife and goes, I don't know, honey, we've never had a wedding here. What do you think? Do you think it'd be nice to have? She goes, yeah, I think that would be really nice. And he actually had a little chapel built into his home. He had this big home, and it had a small chapel in it. And so he said, sure, we'll have a wedding here. And so they helped us to plan the wedding and everything, and he got his local Adventist church involved, and we had someone to sing, and there was a hairdresser there that did Mala's hair. Mala has beautiful long black hair, and this hairdresser, because it was a wedding, she wove Stephanophyllus flowers into her hair. It was really beautiful. The hairdresser said, well, when the English aristocrats get married, they always have these flowers, Stephanophyllus, woven into their hair. So they did this. And Katrina ordered the flowers, and she went around to all the different florist shops, and they wanted like $2,000, $3,000, $5,000 for the flowers. And she was really discouraged. She didn't have money. So she's walking out of a florist shop one day, and there's a guy walking in, and he's carrying boxes of flowers into the shop. And she stops him and goes, are you a wholesaler for flowers? And he goes, yeah, I am. I have a greenhouse in Hawaii, and I import flowers back to the United States. All these tropical flowers. And she goes, tropical flowers? Yes, they're all tropical. And she goes, this would be perfect. We're going to have a tropical wedding, and would you be willing to get the flowers? And he goes, yes. And she gives him a list, and the guy goes, oh, it'll be about $800 or something. Much cheaper than anything else. So they got beautiful flowers. They found a professional photographer who had a master's degree in photography from New York University. He volunteered to do the photography for free. And everything, the church members all pitched in. They made food for the wedding. And so this wedding, the only thing that we really had to buy was the wedding dress. Otherwise, everything was paid for. And you know how expensive weddings can be. I was talking to my roommate, Dr. Viemeister. Edgar Viemeister got married to she was a medical student at the time. And when they got married, and this was about 30 years ago, I was speaking to the bride's father, and it was a beautiful wedding at the University Church in Loma Linda. And I said, this looks like a very expensive wedding. I'll bet you spent $20,000 on this wedding. And Dr. Carter, who was the father of the bride, said, I wish. Said it was a lot more. Okay. So weddings can be very expensive, and we had this wedding, and it only cost us the price of the wedding dress, and because everybody in the church helped us and pitched in. So we got married, and I sent Mala to nursing school. She got accepted to Pacific Union College, and she didn't really want to go. She was afraid. She hadn't done all that well in school, and she was kind of afraid. Although she did read a lot, she told me that they had a little library in her home, in her village of Chatham, and they had like maybe 100 books in this library. And she said she'd read every book in the library. So she'd read a lot, or somewhat. But when we went to PUC, to go there, the admissions director had arranged for us to stay in this bed and breakfast home at the expense of the college. And the home was in a forest. And we got there late at night, and it was fog everywhere. You couldn't really see where you were. And we were inside this little cabin, and we woke up in the morning, and we opened the door, and we're in the middle of this forest, and there's like pine trees growing all around, and there's deer grazing right outside. Right outside the door, there were deer grazing, and there was a tree that was not more than 20 or 30 feet away, and there's a red-tailed hawk sitting in the branch of the tree just staring at us when we opened the door, and there's this fog wafting through, and it was really beautiful. And Mala looks out, and she goes, "This reminds me of home. I think I could like this place." And I felt like that was a gift from heaven, because she didn't want to go to college. She was afraid to go. But when she saw the surroundings, she felt comfortable there, and she agreed to go. And it took her 5 years to get her associate degree, which is normally a 2-year degree. And we tried to arrange it so that we could guarantee that she'd get through. She got through and graduated. And a month or two before she graduated, somebody from the General Conference came and visited Pacific Union College, and they heard that she was a nurse. Mala's ancestors are from the country of India. So Mala has a dark complexion. She looks like a typical Indian person. And they heard that I was a dentist. So they came and said, "Would you be willing to go and work as missionaries in Bangladesh? We'd like you to go to Bangladesh, because we think you, especially your wife, would fit right in. And we want to make your wife, who's now a nurse, the health director for the entire country for the church." And we have about 3 orphanages and about 40 schools that we're running, little village schools. And you would be in charge of examining all the children and taking care of their health. And so Mala had a job before she graduated as health director for the country of Bangladesh. And we went to Bangladesh, and Mala would go. I was working in the dental clinic. She would go to these villages to inspect the children, provide nursing care, and she would get to work literally in a dugout canoe. She'd drive to the end of the road, and the country had a massive flood, and often the only way you could get there was by canoe or boat. And she literally they would take a log and hollow it out and turn it into a canoe, and she would go to work in dugout canoes across rivers and lakes and get there. And they're paddling her along in this dugout canoe one day, and she asked the canoeist where he lived. And he goes, "I'll show you where I live." And so they go a little bit farther, and he goes, "My house is right down there." It was under 25 feet of water because of the flood. So, the whole country had been devastated by this flood. And we would go to these villages or to an orphanage, and let's say there was 100, 200 kids in the orphanage. She would examine them all, and 60 or 70% would have parasites. And so she would examine them and put them off into groups. They had ringworm, and they had there was another kind of worm that bored into their hands, and you could see these little rings where these worms were, all sorts of things. And so she would figure out what was wrong. And then we would go to a pharmacy and buy medicine to treat maybe 120 children. And for $40, we could buy enough medicine to treat all these children. They had like fungus infections in their skin and leg, and we just would put antifungal cream. And these kids had had these infections for years. And you just put a little cream on them, and in 2 or 3 days it clears up. It was just astonishing. So she's taking care of all these kids, and it was a really amazing experience for us to get over there. But because of the flood, the government fell, because the people blamed the government for the flooding. or the government didn't do enough or something. The government fell, and then a new government came in, and the new government did not like Christian missionaries. Our visas were canceled, and we had to go home. We were only there about 7 or 8 months, and we had to leave. But I think all through my life, there have been, what time are we going till? Or a little over. Well, I've only 25% through my lecture. Anyway, I could tell you a lot more stories. I've got about 6 more stories I want to tell you, but we obviously don't have time for that. But when I look back on my life, I see a whole series of events that were highly improbable, like getting into dental school or meeting my wife, who was flown 6,000 miles to meet me. And it's been, even when I told you a story yesterday about when I was in Vietnam, and there's more Vietnam stories I could tell you about compassion and taking, I was a soldier, and I found that I spent more time caring for people and protecting them than I did being a soldier. And I always look back on that and said, well, how is it that I was a soldier and I was taking care of people all the time, or often? And when I look back on my life, I'm constantly reminded of how much God has blessed me. And I hear people say they don't believe in God because God doesn't answer prayers. And when I hear people talk like that, I'm astonished. I'm going, but God does answer prayers. In fact, before I even pray, He answers prayers for me. I never wanted to be a dentist, but God knows better. Fortunately, God knows better than we do. He knows what's best for us. And so He thought that I should go to dental school. And I'm really glad I did, because it's been a blessing. And I look back in my life and I see all these wonderful, wonderful blessings, like becoming a dentist, getting this beautiful... And my wife is the best cook in the world, I'll have you know. And when we were missionaries in St. Vincent, one of our patients was the Ambassador General of the Republic of China. And we invited her to our home for lunch a few times, and she loved my wife's cooking. She said, we cook Chinese food for her, of course. And she goes, you are really a good cook. Would you be willing to cook for our Chinese New Year celebration at the Chinese embassy? And Mala said, sure, I'd be happy to help. How many people are you going to invite? And the ambassador said, only about 360 people. So my wife ended up cooking for 360 people. And the first person through the line was the Prime Minister. Second person was the Minister of Education, which I had met previously. And we're serving this food to all these people going through, and he goes, Dr. Trott, I didn't know that you ran a catering service. And I said, we don't. And he kind of looked at me like, so my wife has been a wonderful blessing. I could not have been a missionary without her, because she did so much. I could not have been a missionary without her constant help. So I feel she was a real blessing. So I've come to the point where every day when I go to work, or wherever I'm going, or whatever I'm doing, I'm expecting God to provide the means necessary to get through the problems that lie ahead. I know I can't do it by myself. As my mother told me, you can't take care of yourself, and she was right. But God can take care of us. He can provide everything you need. And so we have to be looking for God's blessings. We have to be harvesting His blessings. I'm told when the Muslims pray, I'm told that they pray with their hands like this to receive His blessings. Well, that's what we should be thinking all of the time. We should be expecting Him to bless us. And I'm a teacher at Loma University, and one of the things I've learned is don't help the students that don't want to be helped. They'll resent it. If anything goes wrong, they'll say it's my fault because I helped them, that their project didn't work out right. And I've kind of learned, don't help people that don't want to be helped. And even at the dental school, I would say maybe 10% of the students want help. But if they want help, I'll sit down and I'll spend hours with them, showing them what to do. And they tend to be really grateful. But God is trying to help all of us. He's trying to bless all of us. And this, if you go back and read Isaiah 65, it says he was being sought by a people who weren't looking for him, to a nation that had not called me in my name. I stretched my hand all day long to a rebellious people. These were God's chosen people, and God described them as rebellious. Now, I look back on my own life and go, was I ever rebellious? Don't answer that, okay? But God is trying to bless us, but I doubt that even in the church, or certainly in the world, there's not more than 10% of the people that really want to be helped. They want His blessings. But I want you to expect God to bless you and to guide you and give you wisdom and guidance, because He's looking for people that are willing to accept His blessings. And if you are willing to accept His blessings, He will bless you in astonishing ways. Now, it's not going to be easy. I mean, look at the prophets, Elijah, Elisha. You know, was it Elijah ran off? It was Jezebel was trying to kill him, and he ran off into the wilderness. And the angels came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" "Well, she's trying to kill me and I ran away." And the Lord says, "I've got work for you to do. I want you to go to these 3 countries and talk to these kings and anoint these." You know, when the Lord blesses you, He blesses you with a responsibility. He gives you a work to do that nobody else is doing or willing or capable of doing. And He doesn't ask just anybody. He picks a special person to do this work, who He has prepared. Like, forgive me for picking on you today, Hannah, but I think God chose you for that work. And He has a work for every one of us. It might be to take care of a child. It might be to be an encouragement to your neighbor, to your grandparents or something. But He has a work for you to do. It's going to be difficult, but He will give you the strength to do it. So I want you, when you go out, to expect God to bless you and strengthen you and make you effective and meaningful and a blessing to those around you. May God bless you one and all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So, sure, let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank You for Your leading in our lives. Thank You for the experiences Dr. Trott has related, and you can see how You led him. And help us as we go forward to look to You for our strength, for our salvation, and surrender ourselves totally to You, so that You can use us how You desire. In Jesus' name, amen.